Hi there, Julian Bollitter here from Audric. This AILA conference asks us to negotiate with and reimagine a world at risk of collapse by moving between spectacle and deep understanding, exploring and designing new social, cultural, economic and ecological frameworks. No small ask that. So what collapse exactly? There's so many to choose from: economic, societal, ecological, cultural, or all of these. The collapse I want to talk about is the collapse of a dream, and in particular the Australian suburban dream, and how an innovative, let's say spectacular, suburban project on the edge of Perth attempts to breathe new life into the dream, but as to some degree founded on the rocks of resistance from government, development and other planners and designers. In a bid to provide some hope, I conclude with a deeper understanding this conference seeks as to how things could be different in future aspirational projects. So the structure of the presentation I'll give today: firstly, we'll talk about the collapse of the Australian dream, and we'll explore how that's running out of steam on many fronts in Perth. We'll consider the spectacle of the landscape urbanist-inspired Wungong structure plan, which is being currently under construction on the southeast fringe of Perth. And in part 3 of the talk, we'll seek a deeper understanding and look at the various barriers this innovative project has confronted in terms of suburban open space provision, and how some of those barriers might be mitigated in future projects. Firstly, to the dream, the collapse of the dream. At the dawn of the 20th century, American planning proponent Frederick Howe wrote, "The great cities of Australia are spread out into the suburbs in a splendid way. For miles about are broad roads with small houses, gardens, and an opportunity for touch with a freer, sweeter life which the country offers. Indeed, the suburban form of city enabled residents to produce food, cope with much household waste on site, to express themselves through their gardens, as well as moderate their local climate through planting, pursue a variety of hobbies, to have pets, and generally to be able to live outdoors in relative privacy. Despite these undoubted virtues, it would appear that the suburban city model adopted across Australia is running out of steam, or even collapsing in some environmental and societal terms." The brief for this conference implores: we are threatened with a collapse of ecologies critical to the survival and vitalities of communities and cultures. These maps bear witness to this situation. This is a map of the vegetation associations of the Swan coastal plain prior to European settlement and today. And much of the destruction of biodiversity in the Perth area has been due to suburban development, as well as agricultural development out into the wheat belt. So evidence of the perilous state of the Southwest Australia biodiversity hotspot in which Perth sits is that the region now has more species of threatened plants than other Australian states and most countries of the world. This is concerning. A city's livability and viability is fundamentally tied to the natural systems that support it. In this respect, fringe suburban development in Perth can be seen to be concomitantly eroding both the biodiversity of the hotspot and also the livability of Perth. Moreover, the way we currently practice suburban development in Perth, while it tends to obliterate natural systems, it also exhausts basic raw materials, such as we can see here with the amount of yellow sand fill which is required to lift suburban development, business as usual suburban development up above often waterlogged land. This form of development is very intensive for this kind of sand, which is ironic given sand is the one thing you would think Perth would never run out of. Perth is already experiencing groundwater shortages, in part resulting from a drying climate symptomatic of climate change. This diagram shows local government areas in the northern development front, many of which have much suburban development underway, where groundwater allowances have been over-allocated, and with presently a kind of decisions there to be made as to how we actually irrigate public open space. Groundwater typically being the main source of water we would use for irrigation, but in some cases, particularly on private land, this is now switching to largely desalinated seawater. Tim Flannery has gone as far as to warn that on the basis of declining availability of water, Perth could be the 21st century first ghost metropolis. This is obviously inflammatory commentary, but there's a big question about how we'll irrigate open space and to some degree private space in these new suburbs on the northern development front. Talking about the suburban dream and the kind of issues it confronts as it eats into the biodiversity hotspots, one of the main issues is also the exposing of new urban development to fire-prone areas, which you can imagine are opened up as urban development eats into that biodiversity hotspot. The vulnerability of these areas, which is shown here in this diagram, is alarming in the context of the 2021 epic megafires on the east coast. There is also an emerging urban divide between outer suburban areas and the inner suburbs. As Jane Frances Kelly explains, one result of this is a new urban divide, one which is changing Australia and challenging long-held ideals of fairness. There's a growing gap between people who live near the centre of our cities and those who live near the outer fringes. Those near the centre have access to the cultural amenity and economic opportunity and the knowledge economy jobs of the city centre, while those on the fringe typically don't. This map shows deprivation levels across Perth's local government areas, and it shows relative estimations of high deprivation blighting outer and sometimes middle ring suburbs. Finally, these issues are also finding expression in levels of psychological distress. And we can see from this diagram here that in some of the outer suburbs and middle ring suburbs, according to Torrens University, we're finding that there's between 11 and 12 people out of 100 who are experiencing some kind of psychological distress, which is compounded in outer suburbs and compounded by things like long commutes, a lack of meaningful employment, and some of the climate change issues we're seeing, which are the brunt of which is increasingly being felt in those outer suburbs. So where is landscape architecture in all this? At its best, landscape architecture seeks to reconcile mechanistic urban development with the complexities of ecological, hydrological and cultural systems. At its worst, however, landscape architecture is tasked with producing the landscape packaging for outer suburban development. In the end, it can be trivialised and commodified by the development process. As Richard Weller explains, in deference to ecological systems, the landscape that the new suburb almost inevitably erases is returned to the new development as a thematic veneer, a symbolic pastiche, or a hapless remnant of its former self. For a profession that sees itself as stewards of the earth, this is a difficult situation to reconcile. It is in reaction to this situation which landscape architecture is trivialised in the development process that landscape urbanism emerges in the early 2000s, claiming to include within the purview of all landscape urbanist designs all that is in the landscape, infrastructure and buildings, etc. Do this at scales which bridge the divide between landscape design, landscape ecology and site planning. So what do landscape urbanists actually believe? The core tenets of landscape urbanism are that landscape urbanism foregrounds the landscape as the ultimate system to which all goes and from which all comes, a template for urbanism. So in this, they're not regarding cities fundamentally, the building block of cities not actually being buildings, which is how a new urbanist might construct it, but is actually the landscape systems onto which everything else is then grafted. Landscape urbanism rejects the Macagian binary coding between nature and culture. This is also the idea implied in new urbanism that the city is a cultural product and that should be compact and neatly delineated from biodiversity around the city. In landscape urbanism, there's a much more fluid idea of a hybridized ecology which interweaves nature and culture. Finally, landscape urbanism is a test of being less concerned with what things look like and more with what they do, which relates to the final principle, which is landscape urbanism rejects style, image, scene, and symbolism as dominant aspects of design. So essentially, landscape urbanism claims to be interested in instrumentality of landscapes, what the roles they perform as opposed to their style. It's not to say they don't have style, but the function is meant to be dominant in the relationship. There are other dimensions of landscape urbanism, but I've omitted them because of the necessary brevity of this presentation. But given landscape urbanism is entering its middle age, according to Charles Waldheim, it's time to examine how landscape urbanism theory and its central proposition that landscape can act as a template for urbanism has been expressed in built projects, which should be said have been few and far between. However, the Wungong project near Armidale and on the southeast edge of Perth does allow us to reflect broadly on this claim. The award-winning Landscape Structure Plan, which I'll henceforth call the plan, which it's pictured here, is currently in the process of construction on the fringes of Perth. It embodies a number of innovations, including the proposition of an integrated public open space and stormwater management matrix to clean water before entering the Wungong River, and the use of public open space matrix as the primary guidelines for development. In this sense, the plan embodies the landscape urbanism notion that landscape can function as a template for urbanism. The landscape urbanism origins of the plan in part derived from a 2004 provocation by the then client, the Armidale Redevelopment Authority to the design team, the University of Western Australia Landscape Architecture Program, for a concept plan as if the landscape really mattered. Led by Richard Weller, who's a published landscape urbanist, the delivery of the Wungong plan shifted to the Metropolitan Redevelopment Authority in 2010 and currently rests with Development WA. Firstly, to the site, one of the challenges of the Wungong site is the presence of geomorphic or groundwater dependent wetlands, which experience short periods of seasonal surface inundation. And we can see them here marked in blue, both on the northeast and southeast development fronts of Perth. So many suburbs are now being developed on land which is essentially these geomorphic wetlands. So given all the hoo-ha about landscape urbanism, what are the innovative principles actually behind the Wungong plan? Innovative principle 1 is that the public open space system acts as the primary guidelines for urban development. So it's beyond being merely the ornamental public open space that characterises many suburban developments. The Wungong Plan integrated public open space and stormwater management system acts as a structuring device that informs the location of the activity centres, pictured here in yellow, and denser urban areas in primary and high schools, as well as informing the geometry of the road network, which runs both parallel and perpendicular to the linearity of the public open space network. It is through this structuring of linear public open space that the Wungong project arguably provides an example of landscape urbanism broadening landscape architecture's field of influence into infrastructural and urban planning-based issues. Indeed, the Wungong Plan seeks the creation of a new suburban model where environment and urban development exist in an interwoven system, and in which the landscape itself could genuinely inform the character and structure of suburban development. Innovative principle number 2 is the provision of a holistic public open space system. At the same time, the public open space system forms this overarching holistic system across the whole development area, which, according to the designers, will encourage active modes of transport, convey wildlife, protect and connect Aboriginal heritage sites, and provide the otherwise raw suburban development with a distinctive and binding character on a scale commensurate with the development. As the director of the Armidale Redevelopment Authority, John Ellis, explained at the time of the linear network, we visualised flying over Perth at 30,000 feet and being able to see Wong and seeing the straight lines of the linear public open space, like Louis XIV coming to Perth. Innovative principle number 3 is an integrated public open space and stormwater system. Indeed, the Wungong Plan proposes a POS matrix integrated with a comprehensive stormwater system. The linear network of POS consists of living streams, park avenues and adjoining community parks, which you can see here. The living streams are essentially retrofitted open drains, which are a legacy of this site's agricultural past, and the Wungong Plan proposes that they are substantially altered to make them conform to this fairly rigid orthogonal structure and to become multifunctional with respect to delivering recreational and ecological function. The project has a polarising effect on local and national commentators. For instance, 2007, the plan received the Planning Institute of Australia's President Award for Planning Excellence. However, subsequently in a non-mandatory 2010 peer review, the project has been regarded as impractical, concerning and a deeply flawed vision, and in another forum, a disaster by a past West Australian President of the Urban Development Institute of Australia. Certainly the project has elicited strong reactions within the West Australian design, planning and land development communities. But what are to be made of such commentaries, and how can proponents of similar ideas in the future perhaps learn from the process? In this section of the presentation, I explore the resistance to the Wungong Plan from within the urban design and planning disciplines, the development community, and regulatory bodies. Arguably, some of the negative assessments of the Wungong Plan from within the urban design and planning disciplines have been driven in part by agendas, ideological or otherwise. Indeed, the adversarial 2010 peer review of the Wungong Plan involved planners and urban designers who had previously been involved in authoring Perth's new urbanism-inspired livable neighbourhoods code. So this was at a time when the suburban development industry was just being enmeshed around livable neighbourhoods, and such as authors would have been particularly sensitive to the perceived challenge posed by the Wungong model. And we can see the difference here with the livable neighbourhoods, a new urbanism-inspired suburb of Butler, pictured on Perth's northern development corridor, as a typically disconnected public open space system, the structure which contrasts strongly with the Wungong Plan's holistic and interconnected POS system. So one of the main critiques from within the the planning and urban design community was that the Wungong's plan proposed an inequitable distribution of open space by virtue of it not being distributed into smaller parks, which were, I guess, more distributed like a kind of confetti through the urban system. The second critique stems from a kind of belief that there's an inadequate provision of adequately usable public open space by virtue of it being linear. So there's a long-standing ambivalence by new urbanism to such models. Indeed, the leader of the new urbanist movement, Andre Duany, has been particularly dismissive of linear parks, describing them as a extended venue for crime. In the 2010 Wungong peer review, the linear public open space system was regarded as inadequate and not usable because of its narrowness. As one reviewer joked in a different forum, the Wungong development will produce a generation of talented AFL players because kids will need to be able to kick in a particularly straight line to keep it within the public open space reserve. The third critique from the urban design and planning industry and community in Perth was that the urban centres, which are sort of pictured here in yellow, did not capitalise on the movement economy due to their distribution relating primarily to the open space system. So there's a kind of conflict here where the reviewers are feeling that density should relate to the road network and perhaps public transport, as opposed to the spines of open space, which has been the decision here. And I think this flows from a broader idea proposed by new urbanism that landscape urbanism can make a kind of bucolic contribution to civic space, but it's ultimately incapable of delivering urban fabric. So in this sense, density is being appended to open space as opposed to more sensible criteria like the access of perhaps public and private transport in the form of roads in particular. The resistance from the development community was also significant, and they expressed reservations in terms of the viability of the development proposed by the plan from an economic perspective. And there was many problems in the process of development, some of which started with the dividing of the master plan area into 13 cells, with each cell having typically a separate developer and requiring its own structure plan. So the first main point of contention or resistance was the developer contribution system to fund the holistic interconnected public open space system. It was regarded as unfair by some developers who were in control of development sites, which perhaps were further away from the actual open space where some of the development contribution scheme money was being invested. So there was a sense of unfair allocation, rightly or wrongly. They also raised issues around how the holistic public open space and stormwater system posed many coordination issues in relation to how drainage networks are coordinated from one site to another. As a project engineer on the project explained, in an area like this, which is essentially one big drainage catchment, the system breaks down when you cut it up into precincts. You can't do an overarching design and retain it. As soon as someone starts saying we need a flat lot, then you've changed the levels of the roads, you change the level of the drainage system, and it all starts unravelling bit by bit. And frankly, when a developer goes ahead here and sets a level for the drainage system, the people upstream can't connect their system in without having 4 metres of sand fill, which is something we can see pictured here. So while the plan was ostensibly driven by landscape issues, according to the designers, according to this critique, it offers limited recognition of the topographical constraints of the redevelopment site, something which the project reviewers described led to drainage ostensibly going uphill in some cases, leading to unrealistic fill requirements. The third main critique was that the plan overly limited the ability of developers to adapt or adopt their own style for each precinct. As Richard Weller, one of the designers, explains, what irked the various developers and their design teams most when they found they had to work with the overarching system of the avenues was that they were not free to shape the plans of their subdivisions as they normally would. They argued, somewhat ironically, that the avenues limited their ability to create a distinctive sense of place for their particular project. An ex-project director explains this was particularly an issue with one of the major developers of the project. Stockland, how do you say it, like to put their own stamp on things. If you go see a Stockland development in Brisbane, Melbourne or Perth, there's a lot of similar elements to it. They're not bespoke. They have a kind of formula, and having these kinds of living streams and park avenues didn't work with their formula. They wanted to skew the living streams in different directions. The developers' concerns about perceived limitations and how they could theme and style their developments were no doubt not alleviated by the plant design team's assertion that the overall character and markability of Wungong is that the project's identity is not to be achieved through cosmetic styling, but rather structural clarity. Now we turn to critiques and resistance to the Wungong plan from regulatory bodies. Okay, so by way of background, the construction of the Wungong plan is being overseen by Development WA and is an official designated redevelopment area, which is excised from normal state and local government approval processes and policies. This has not always been enough, however, to present resistance to the project's implementation at both the state and local government level. The critiques from regulatory bodies also focused on the narrowness of the public open space, which was regarded as not being functional and was seen to reflect a deprivation of recreational opportunity, particularly from the perspective of active recreation. And there's a big lot of contention in Perth about whether we have enough room for ovals. Secondly, regulatory bodies, there was concern about the overlapping and recreational and hydrological functions of the open space, because it was causing delays in design approvals because of the large number of regulatory bodies who are required to approve designs. As a project engineer explains, as soon as you have multiple organisational lines drawn over one bit of land, we seem to have trouble dealing with it. This complexity arises from a situation which living streams can't be just done in the drainage corridor, which is freehold land owned by Water Corporation. You need land on either side, so you need to reach a longer-term management, maintenance and liability agreement with the local authority. Who mows the lawn, who maintains the bike path needs to be worked out, all of which adds to the complexity and time required for implementing living stream orientated open space. And we can see here the number of different regulatory bodies which need to be coordinated with and approval sought from for the development of the living streams, which are the backbone of the system. And then thirdly, the confusion about the responsibilities for the ongoing maintenance of multifunctional stormwater and public open space matrices. So overlapping these in formal terms has its complexities. Many of the challenges arise from the fact of who maintains what and who takes responsibility for what over the longer term. So how have these myriad of challenges expressed themselves in the approved structure plans for Wungong? Here we can see the before image of the landscape structure plan, and then the structure plans which have been submitted and approved by the MRA and now Development WA for most of the precincts, not all of the precincts of the larger Wungong site. And we can see there's a comparative disjunction going on, particularly in terms of the geometry. So this cosmetic restyling that the developers saw has certainly happened to some degree, and that's led to perhaps a decline in the overall legibility of the project. And the geometries are becoming more convoluted, and the orthogonal sort of geometries are watered down. Indeed, the sense of Louis XIV coming to Perth has been greatly diminished in the approved structure plans. Moreover, the areas of urban density proposed in the plan appear to have been reduced. As a previous project director explained, I drove through a couple of years ago and the quality of the housing was what you would expect in the southeast sector. There was no uplift. All these visions had gone by the wayside. It was just another suburb. Very disappointing. Reflecting the challenges, very little of the Wungong plan has actually been built. The image in the top right showing the main area of redevelopment, which is a small fraction of this much larger site. And in the intervening 10 years, I guess since or I should say 12 years since the adversarial peer review in 2010, very little has happened in Wungong, while other suburbs in the southeast corridor have experienced significant development. Where development has occurred on the ground, the experience of the living streams, such as you can see here, are quite pleasant and appear to work and balance passive recreational and hydrological function. How could some of the barriers to such innovative projects be mitigated? This summary table sets out the mitigating strategies that planners could deploy in future urban projects, attempting suburban public open space innovations. So the columns here refer to mitigating resistance from within the urban design and planning disciplines, mitigating resistance from developers, and then from regulatory bodies. It's not to say that these strategies weren't present to some degree in the Wungong process and plan. However, these things which the process has definitely reinforced as being important. The first, in terms of mitigating resistance from planning and urban design disciplines, is to bring more people into the tent as you go along. So ensuring design proposals have more peer review through the process. Play the ball, not the man. Ensure peer review participants are independent and impartial and without ideological affinity with alternative urban design and planning models. Perhaps easier said than done, but certainly this was an issue, I think, with the adversarial 2010 peer review. Picking your battles. Something that would have helped in Wongong might have been to provide a detailed account of what existing state government policies, planners and designers were following, and that they were deviating from with an appropriate justification. One of the things about Wongong is there's certain elements of it were quite new urbanist. Perhaps they weren't reinforced in the way they could have been, and if they had, it may have alienated the reviewers less than subsequently occurred. Defence, develop a scientific basis such as a needs-based assessment from which innovative public open space systems can be argued to work, so as to fend off related critiques which are otherwise likely to surface. So this is trying to use data in a way which can provide evidence against ideological arguments and critiques, such as Wongong experience. Mitigating resistance from developers. I think having developers fully involved earlier in the project may have helped. Now that happened to some degree, I believe, in the process of the Wongong project, but the earlier the commercial reality is factored in, the more efficient the planning process will be. Certainly what happened in Wongong is developers were engaged early, however, perhaps didn't express their concerns at the right moment, and when the change of state government enabled them to get in the ear of the development minister, and then those critiques became really damaging. But obviously getting them earlier in the piece is going to ease the process. One-on-one, I think part of the problem with Wongong is trying to deal with a number of different developers and coordination sites, which poses coordination issues between those sites. So using a single land developer and bringing them into the design process early can definitely help. Not always to do, but the phasing, one step at a time. Developing a phasing strategy that allows a testing of market demand and the actual usage of pilot public open space projects to reassure developers that innovative POS matrices are usable, can increase land value and are subsequently worthy of investment. And then finally, defence number 2, ensure planning for water sensitive urban design, public open space, fully deals with the science of hydrological issues. So not to open such planning to critique by those from the development community or otherwise who have differing agendas. Sometimes such uncertainties can leave openings. And finally, mitigating resistance from regulatory bodies. We really need to develop in Perth and elsewhere protected spaces to allow experiments to emerge and develop. For example, drainage engineers relaxing requirements around flow measurements and even overzealous safety requirements in these living stream models to allow experimentation. In terms of this issue of trying to negotiate with a multitude of different partners who might oversee the development of a living stream, creating an overarching steering committee which reflects the approval agencies required for particularly integrated public open space and stormwater matrices, so that decisions can be made quickly and collaboratively, ensure the group is maintained over the lifetime of the project. So arguably the Wongong's plan and its overarching structure varies little from an established tradition of landscape architects, bringing open space networks to the fore in suburban planning, such as in Riverside in Chicago, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, and Griffin's Castle Crag in Sydney. While these precedents are well established and may lessen claims concerning Wongong's plan's innovation, the real innovation is, or the real challenge with such a spatial plan, is reconciling it with the conditions on the ground in all their economic, hydrological, ecological, social and political complexity. While many designers advocate form as being a mechanism through which a particular society can be engaged for positive ends, it's important that the process of design, development and maintenance in itself is carefully designed. Something that in some aspects Wongong has struggled with. As the landscape urbanist James Corner explains, what is required is a utopia of process, not just a utopia of form. So this presentation has considered the collapse of the Australian dream and set out a spectacular project, which sought to breathe new life into the dream, and then considered the resistance the dream confronted and how landscape architects could mitigate such resistance perhaps in future projects, attempting similar innovations. In reflecting on this exercise, it can be argued that within Perth's planning discipline, development industry and regulatory context, we need to develop a more nurturing attitude towards innovative landscape-driven proposals, a spirit that acknowledges that there is room and indeed the need for more than one suburban model in Perth and Australian cities generally. This is important because recent data from the ABS highlights that continued strong demand for detached housing is occurring, with private sector housing approvals reaching a new record high in April this year. Thus, the allure of the quintessential suburban lifestyle appears to have been heightened by the pandemic. Clearly, we need models that work with humanity's enduring love for suburban living, but are also reconciled with ecological considerations. While Wungong might not be exactly the answer to this conundrum, it clearly holds lessons and clues for landscape architects and urbanists going forward. Thanks for listening. Thanks to Audric sponsors, the WAPC, Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage, Department of Communities and Development WA, and to the Australian Institute of Landscape Architects for the opportunity to present.